The air in the executive boardroom of Centurion Systems was heavy with the aroma of freshly brewed Colombian coffee, expensive Italian leather, and the faint chemical scent of citrus carpet cleaner that had been applied the night before. Outside, a late morning autumn rain streaked across the massive floor-to-ceiling glass panes of the skyscraper, turning the city skyline of Cleveland into a blur of gray, silver, and amber. I sat near the far end of the long mahogany table, my fingers resting on the cool aluminum case of my laptop. My name is Keith Bradley. I am 48 years old, and my face is the kind of quiet, unremarkable, and weathered face that junior associates walk past in the corridor without a second glance. My job title, Senior Security Architect, was designed to sound dry and technical, a bureaucratic label to keep recruiters from calling me. But everyone who actually worked in the server rooms knew the truth. I was the person who built the core security grid that protected our entire enterprise, and 24 of the largest Fortune 500 corporations in the country. My journey to this boardroom began in a small, grease-stained automotive repair shop on the outskirts of Detroit. My father was a dedicated mechanic who spent 40 years under the hoods of domestic cars, his hands permanently stained with motor oil and carbon. My mother managed a local diner, working double shifts to make sure my brother and I had shoes for school. They did not understand computers, but they understood work. Dad used to tell me that a building is only as strong as its foundation, and that a person who looks down on the person sweeping the floor is the same person who crumbles when the engine fails. He taught me to respect the tools, to understand how every part of a machine connected to the others, and to never assume a system could run without proper maintenance. I carried that philosophy through college and into 20 years of technical consulting, but corporate executives like Stuart Preston had never spent a day getting their hands dirty or learning how the machinery of their business actually operated. I had been working at Centurion Systems for 9 months as an independent consultant. I started back when the company realized their old network security was leaking data like a sieve, exposing client records and trade secrets. The board had approved a massive project to secure their entire infrastructure, a defense grid valued at $720 million. The system was designed to protect not just our data, but the sensitive intellectual property of our major clients, including Apex Aerospace, Summit Capital, and Meridian Production. It was a massive undertaking, requiring 9 months of sleepless nights, thousands of lines of custom code, and a deep understanding of cryptographic protocols. I was the only person who knew how every layer of the grid fit together, and then came the boardroom meeting. Stuart Preston, the vice president of operations, stood at the head of the table. Stuart was 36 years old, wore a tailored gray suit that was slightly too tight, and spent most of his day repeating words he had heard in business seminars. He looked down his nose at me, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, wearing the smug expression of a manager who had never once had to clean up his own technical mess. He announced that my consulting contract was terminated immediately. The words fell from his mouth like heavy stones dropping onto the polished table. He claimed the company was taking its security operations in a different direction, and that they no longer needed my expensive services. Around the table, the other executives suddenly found their documents and coffee cups incredibly interesting. Cynthia Thorne, the legal counsel, stared intently at her yellow pad, scribbling meaningless lines to avoid meeting my gaze. Richard Miller, the finance chief, took a slow, deliberate sip from his mug, refusing to look up. Only Diana Foster, the chief technology officer who had fought to hire me 9 months ago, shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her mouth opening slightly as if to protest before she caught Preston's warning glare and fell silent. She knew the mistake he was making, but she lacked the authority to overrule the vice president of operations. I did not raise my voice. I did not slam my laptop shut or demand a dramatic explanation. Instead, I let a quiet, knowing smile touch the corners of my mouth. I began systematically closing my active terminal windows, saving my current sessions, and disconnecting my external hard drives. I stood up, carefully winding my power cable and placing it into my leather briefcase. Stuart Preston sneered at my calm movements, claiming that he thought a high-priced contractor like me would have more to say when shown the door. He added that his internal IT staff was more than capable of running the systems I built, and that they did not need my expensive oversight anymore. I closed my briefcase and snapped the brass latches shut. I told him that I was sure he believed that, keeping my tone perfectly neutral as I gathered my coat. Before I walked out, I checked the face of my watch and turned to Stuart. I asked him who was going to explain to the chairman why the entire security grid would cease to function in exactly 6 minutes. The silence that fell over the boardroom was absolute. Preston's face, previously flushed with the triumph of his power play, suddenly lost its color. He stammered, asking what I had just said. I replied that it was actually 5 minutes and 30 seconds now. My cryptographic credentials had to authenticate with the primary server every 96 hours. If that did not happen, the system would recognize a critical breach, assume the network was compromised, and initiate an automatic complete lockdown. I walked out of the room, leaving them in stunned silence. The mahogany table in the boardroom seemed to stretch on forever, reflecting the cold light of the digital displays on the wall. Stuart Preston stood there, chest puffed out, completely oblivious to the digital avalanche he was about to trigger. He had spent his entire career in corporate operations, moving from one management role to another, treating technical teams as replaceable assets. He did not know that a single line of bad code could halt a factory line, or that security was not a product you bought, but a process you maintained. I looked at Diana Foster, who was looking down at her hands, unable to meet my eyes. She had been my ally, but in this moment she was trapped by the corporate hierarchy. I recalled my father's words as I packed my things. He used to say that some people think they are the driver, just because they are sitting in the passenger seat, shouting directions. They do not know how the transmission works. They do not know how the brakes work, but they are the first to complain when the car stops. Stuart was that passenger. He was about to learn that you cannot drive a car without an engine. As the brass latches of my briefcase closed with a sharp click, I felt a deep sense of relief. The burden of carrying this company's security was no longer mine. I walked out of the boardroom and down the quiet carpeted hallway of the executive suite, the two security guards trailing behind me at a respectful distance. Behind me, the boardroom door burst open, and the sound of panicked, raised voices spilled into the corridor. I did not quicken my pace. I walked toward the elevators, pressed the call button, and waited. Before the elevator doors could open, Diana Foster ran down the hall, her heels clicking rapidly against the polished floor. She stopped a few feet from me, gasping for air, and asked if I was exaggerating. She wanted to know if the system was really going to lock down. I turned to face her, maintaining my calm expression. I told her that the system required my active digital signature to verify that the primary architect was still monitoring the network. Since Stuart had just terminated my contract and deactivated my profile, the primary server would register my absence as an unauthorized takeover. At that point, the entire system would encrypt its own root directories and disconnect all external nodes. Diana asked if there was an override sequence. I explained that there was, but it required the complete technical documentation that I had prepared. As she might recall, Stuart had refused to approve the $22,000 invoice for the complete documentation package, claiming it was an unnecessary expense. The basic documentation he received only went up to Section 9, while the override protocols were in Section 12. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. I stepped inside and turned around, telling her that I was sorry, but I could not work under those conditions. The doors slid shut, cutting her off. By the time I reached the ground floor and walked it out into the crisp morning air, the digital countdown on my phone had reached 0. At that exact moment, the security grid of Centurion Systems went dark. Under my consulting agreement, which Stuart clearly had not read, the proprietary source code for the security grid remained my intellectual property. The contract granted Centurion Systems a conditional software license that was strictly tied to my active participation as the primary architect. The moment they terminated my contract without cause, that license evaporated. Under federal copyright laws, specifically Title 17, Section 106 of the United States Code, any unauthorized use, modification, or attempt to bypass my software constituted a direct and willful federal copyright infringement. I crossed the street and entered a quiet coffee shop, ordering a cup of strong black coffee. My attorney and cousin, Mason Bradley, had set up his office just 4 blocks away. Mason was a brilliant legal mind who specialized in intellectual property and independent contractor protections. He had warning signs in his office that read, "Never trust a corporate handshake." He had built specific protections into my contract, knowing that large corporations often tried to absorb the work of external developers and cast them aside once the system was stable. Within minutes of my contract termination, I sent Mason a copy of the termination notice. He immediately drafted a formal cease and desist letter and emailed it directly to Cynthia Thorne, the legal counsel. The letter was clear and unyielding. It stated that any attempt by Centurion Systems to access, run, or bypass the proprietary security code would result in immediate federal litigation for copyright infringement under Title 17, Section 504, with statutory damages of up to $150,000 per instance. In addition, the letter pointed out that Stewart's unilateral decision to fire the primary security architect without consulting the board of directors violated state corporate statutes regarding fiduciary duties. By exposing the company to massive operational downtime and potential litigation from their 24 Fortune 500 clients, Stewart had acted with gross negligence, potentially exposing the executives to personal liability. I watched the glass skyscraper across the street through the coffee shop window, seeing the faint silhouettes of people moving rapidly from office to office as the network went cold. The emergency lights on the upper floors began to flicker, signaling that the backup systems were struggling to handle the sudden disconnection. The hallway outside the boardroom was quiet, the thick carpet absorbing the sound of our footsteps. Diana's face was flushed, her breathing shallow as she tried to comprehend the scale of what was about to happen. She had spent the last 9 months working with me, seeing the detail I put into every firewall rule and encryption key. She knew that the internal IT team was not lazy, but they were severely understaffed and lacked the specialized training required to manage a network of this scale. They were help desk technicians, not cybersecurity specialists. As I waited for the elevator, I thought about the contract Mason and I had drafted. We had spent 3 days in his small office, surrounded by stacks of legal books, refining the intellectual property clauses. Mason had pointed out that many companies try to claim ownership of any software developed during a contract, even if it was built using proprietary tools the developer brought with them. We had specifically written the license to be conditional on my active role as the primary architect. If they terminated me, they terminated their right to use the software. It was a simple, elegant legal shield, and Stewart had walked right into it, because he did not bother to read the contract before signing the termination notice. My phone began to vibrate on the table, and the screen showed Stewart's Preston's name. I answered and placed it on the table, switching to speakerphone. Stewart was screaming, his voice cracking with rage, calling me a backstabbing contractor. He yelled that the entire network was down, and 25 of their largest clients, including Apex Aerospace, had lost their monitoring feeds. He claimed they were facing millions of dollars in liability and threatened to sue me for everything I owned. I took a slow sip of my black coffee, keeping my voice calm. I suggested he lower his voice and speak to Cynthia Thorne. I explained that she would inform him that they currently had no legal right to touch my software, and that if their IT team tried to force an override, they would be violating federal copyright law. I added that he was already in breach of his contract with Apex Aerospace, which carried a $60 million penalty for security downtime. I told him he had done this to himself. Stewart's anger suddenly turned into desperation. He blurted out that he would write me a check for $8 million. Right then if I came back and turned the system on. I smiled, looking at the steam rising from my cup, and told him it did not work that way. The system was in a secure lockdown, and even if I wanted to, it would take time and the proper authorization. I added that his $8 million meant nothing to me if I had to continue dealing with his incompetence. I told him he had made a foolish business decision based on his ego, and now he had to face the consequences. I hung up the phone. 10 seconds later, my phone rang again. This time, the caller ID showed the name of the executive suite receptionist. I answered, and she asked me to hold for Julian Thorne. Julian Thorne was the founder and chairman of Centurion Systems, a self-made billionaire in his late 60s. He was known for his sharp intellect, his absolute intolerance for corporate political games, and his deep respect for technical expertise. He was not a man anyone wanted to cross. He had started his career 40 years ago, pulling cables and soldering circuit boards in a drafty warehouse. And he knew that the people who actually did the work were the true foundation of his company. Julian's deep voice boomed through the speaker, telling me he was sitting in his office looking at a blank security monitor while the chief executive of Apex Aerospace was on his other line, asking why his defense systems were blind. He demanded to know what was happening. I took a deep breath and explained that I had been fired 45 minutes ago by Stuart Preston, which triggered a security lockdown protocol I had designed to protect the system from unauthorized access. Since my credentials had been removed, the system assumed a hostile takeover was in progress and encrypted the root directories. Julian was silent for a long moment before asking why Stuart had fired me. I explained that Stuart claimed my consulting fees were too high and that his internal IT team could manage the system. However, Stuart had refused to purchase the technical documentation that would allow his team to perform an override. And my contract stipulated that the software license terminated if my services were discontinued without cause. Julian's voice was dangerously quiet as he asked about the legal consequences. I told him my attorney had sent a formal notice to Cynthia Thorne. Any attempt by their internal IT team to bypass the encryption or modify the code would violate federal copyright laws. In addition, the contract termination without board approval was a breach of fiduciary duty by the operations department, exposing the company to significant shareholder litigation. Julian sighed, calling Stuart an idiot who always let his ego run ahead of his brain. He apologized for Stuart's behavior, praised the system I had built, and asked for my terms to return. In the coffee shop, the warmth of the mug in my hands contrasted with the cold drizzle outside. The phone call from Stuart had been entirely predictable. When a corporate manager loses control, their first instinct is to yell, to threaten, and to try to force the other person to submit. But in this case, he had no leverage. He was holding a hand of empty cards, and he was beginning to realize it. The $60 million penalty with Apex Aerospace was a real threat. Apex was a defense contractor, and any downtime in their monitoring feeds had to be reported to the government, which could lead to their own contracts being audited. Julian Thorne was a different kind of leader. When he spoke, he did not waste time with buzzwords or threats. He wanted facts. He understood that a self-made company could be destroyed in a day if its reputation was compromised. He had spent decades building Centurion Systems, and he was not going to let a vice president's ego destroy his life's work. I could hear the cold anger in his voice when he spoke about Stuart, the kind of anger that precedes a swift and absolute corporate execution. I knew that my terms were steep, but they were necessary to protect the company's future. I had prepared for this moment. I pulled a document up on my tablet and outlined my terms. I told Julian that I would not return as a temporary consultant. If I was to secure this company, I had to have the authority to do so properly. First, I wanted a permanent position as Chief Security Officer with a seat on the executive board. Second, I required a $30 million annual budget for security operations and personnel upgrades. Third, I wanted full authority over all IT security decisions, meaning the IT department would report directly to me on security matters. Finally, my contract had to include a termination clause requiring a unanimous board vote and a 120-day notice period. Julian did not hesitate. He agreed immediately, promising that Cynthia would draft the contract and that my board seat and budget would be waiting for me. He asked how long it would take to get their clients back online. I replied that it would take approximately 110 minutes once I was back in the server room, but I required my credentials restored and a formal signing of the contract before I began. He told me to get back over here and that the contract would be ready. 5 minutes later, I walked back through the front doors of Centurion Systems. The atmosphere in the lobby was tense, with employees whispering in corners. As I reached the elevator, Stuart Preston stepped out, his face pale and his hands trembling. He held a black security badge in his hand and muttered, refusing to look me in the eye as he handed it to me. I thanked him politely, taking the badge, and suggested he prepare his remarks for his meeting with the chairman the next morning. I walked into the executive boardroom, which was now filled with a quiet desperation. Stuart stood by the window, looking out at the city as if searching for an escape. Diana Foster gave me a small, encouraging nod as I took my seat. The new contract was printed on heavy, high-quality paper, the signature lines at the bottom waiting to seal the agreement. I read through the clauses carefully, ensuring that my authority was absolute and my budget was secured against any future operational interference. Once the signatures were in place, I headed down to the server room in the basement. The server room was protected by heavy security doors, biometrics scanners, and a dedicated cooling system that kept the air at a constant 60 degrees. It was a space designed for silence, but today it was filled with the anxious energy of the internal IT staff. Jason Briggs, the head of IT, was staring at a monitor filled with red error messages when I walked in, followed by Sarah Jennings, one of his lead network engineers. They both looked exhausted and terrified. They had spent months trying to maintain a massive network with outdated hardware and no support from the operations department. Jason ran a hand through his hair, expressing relief at my arrival. He explained they had tried running diagnostics, but the system locked them out of the primary directory. He swore they did not touch the code because legal had warned them to stay away. I told him he had made the right call, explaining that if they had tried to bypass the encryption, the system would have interpreted it as an active cyber attack and wiped the secondary backup servers. I sat down at the primary terminal and entered my newly restored credentials. The screen flashed, recognizing my digital signature. I began entering the complex restoration sequence, a 48-character string of alphanumeric symbols and cryptographic keys that I had memorized. As the diagnostic sequence began its 58-minute scan to verify that no malicious actors had attempted to exploit the downtime, I turned to Jason and Sarah, suggesting they learn how this architecture actually worked. I pulled up a schematic on a side monitor and explained that the security grid was built on a 3-layer defense model, which I called the moat, the wall, and the keep. The outer layer, the moat, was our automated traffic filter, using behavioral analysis to monitor incoming data packets. If a connection deviated from normal parameters, it was flagged. Sarah asked about the second layer, and I explained that the wall managed active threat detection, isolating threats in a virtual sandbox or honeypot to protect our clients while tracing the attacker's origin. Jason asked about the keep, and I explained that it was the core, holding the proprietary data of our 24 Fortune 500 clients, protected by quantum-resistant encryption. The only way in was through authorized cryptographic credentials. While we waited, Cynthia Thorne entered and handed me my signed copy of the contract. At exactly 58 minutes, the terminal chimed, indicating the scan was complete and the system was clean. We restored the keep first, then the wall, and finally the moat, bringing the security layers online in reverse order to ensure protection during the transition. One by one, we reconnected our clients, starting with Apex Aerospace, followed by Summit Capital and Meridian Production, until the final indicator turned green. The entire security grid was fully operational again. The server room in the basement was the heart of the company, a place where the physical reality of the network existed. It was a clean, dust-free environment filled with the loud hum of cooling fans and the blinking lights of hundreds of servers. Jason Briggs and Sarah Jennings were standing near the main rack, their faces illuminated by the blue light of the monitors. They looked like soldiers who had been left behind in a retreat, exhausted and waiting for the end. When I walked in, I could see the immediate relief on their faces. I explained the 3-layer model in detail, showing them how the different parts of the system communicated. I wanted them to understand that security was not about locking doors, but about monitoring flow. The moat, the wall, and the keep were not just physical barriers, but logical constructs that managed the flow of data. By teaching them how the system worked, I was not just restoring the network, I was building a team that could protect it in the future. As the scan completed and the system showed green, I felt a quiet satisfaction. The engine was running again, and the foundation was secure. The next morning at 10 o'clock, I walked into the executive conference room for my first official meeting as Chief Security Officer, taking my seat next to Diana Foster. At the far end of the table sat Stuart Preston, looking small and defeated. Julian Thorne entered the room exactly at 10:15, standing for a moment before his gaze settled on Stuart. Julian announced that Stuart's reassignment was effective immediately, moving him to a special projects role in their logistics division with no direct reports, no budget authority, and a compensation reduction of 40%. Stuart nodded silently, knowing he was lucky to keep his job. Stuart's new office was located in a damp, isolated warehouse 3 miles away from corporate headquarters, a facility that handled surplus inventory and old desks. It was a clear signal to everyone in the company that corporate politics would no longer override technical competence. I watched him pack his personal belonging boxes, his head down, finally understanding the weight of his own arrogance. He had tried to treat our critical systems as simple line items on a spreadsheet, and now he was surrounded by cardboard boxes and dusty metal shelving. Over the next 4 months, my life became a whirlwind of productive activity. With my $30 million budget, I hired new security specialists to support Jason and Sarah, giving them the resources they had desperately needed for years. We upgraded our monitoring hardware and established weekly security training sessions for all departments. We replaced the old failing switches and built a comprehensive backup system that ensured we would never face another unexpected outage. We also established a security operations center that monitored the network 24 hours a day, providing real-time threat intelligence. But my favorite part of the new job was the security lab I held every Friday afternoon. I invited employees from every level of the company to participate, teaching them how to spot phishing attempts, how to manage passwords securely, and how to understand the role they played in protecting our network. My father, who had worked for decades as a mechanic in Detroit, always told me that a machine is only as good as the person maintaining it. He taught me to respect the tools, but more importantly, to respect the people who use them. That philosophy guided every decision I made as Chief Security Officer. I did not want to build a culture of fear. I wanted to build a culture of shared responsibility and competence. One afternoon, 4 months after the lockdown, Julian Thorne called me into his office, looking over our quarterly performance reports with a rare smile on his face. He praised the security team's hard work, noting that clients had never felt more secure and that Apex Aerospace was renewing its contract and expanding its services. He then announced that Diana Foster had recommended combining our technical operations, and he wanted me to take on the role of Chief Technology Officer as well, working in partnership with Diana to oversee all engineering and security infrastructure. I accepted the promotion, knowing that the journey from an external consultant to the top of the corporate ladder had not been about personal revenge. It was about standing up for the value of expertise, respecting the people who do the work, and building systems that last. That evening, I called my parents in Detroit to share the news. My father listened to me describe my new role and chuckled, telling me it was a lot of letters but to remember to keep my hands clean and my tools sharp. I promised him I would. As I hung up the phone and looked out over the city lights from my office window, I knew that the security grid I built was strong, but the culture we were building was even stronger. And that was the best revenge of all. The logistics warehouse where Stuart was reassigned was a stark contrast to the executive suite. It was a massive, drafty building, filled with rows of metal racks holding surplus furniture, old computers, and boxes of files. The air smelled of cardboard and diesel exhaust from the delivery trucks. Stuart's new desk was a simple metal table in the corner, with a single phone and an old computer. He was surrounded by the physical evidence of his demotion, a daily reminder of the cost of his arrogance. In the months that followed, the Friday Security Labs became a popular event in the company. We would order pizza and spend 2 hours discussing different aspects of security, from password managers to social engineering. I wanted the employees to feel like they were part of the defense, not just users who were being monitored. This approach transformed the culture of the company. When people feel respected, they take responsibility. That was the lesson my father had taught me in his shop, and it was the lesson that saved Centurion's systems.